Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our video on United States tax policy. I know that sounds exciting, but hopefully by the end of the video you will be excited about this topic. Um, this is one of the videos in our series addressing United States political problems and solutions to those problems. So within this video series, we have videos on, for example, U.S. healthcare policy. We have videos on campaign financing, on immigration. These are, issues that are of some political concern in the United States and that folks, have differences of opinion about and can spend time arguing about. Um, like all the videos in this series, we're going to start with what problem are we trying to solve here. So all of these videos contain proposals to change current policies, but it's in the service of trying to solve a particular problem or a set of problems. And the reason I'm doing that, and the reason we always start there, is because I'm not a big believer in changing things that don't need to be changed, changing things that are working. No reason for that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So if I'm going to do a video on one of these topics, it's because I believe it is broke and we do need to fix it. And so we're always going to start with what problem is this proposal addressing? What's the problem? How does this solve it? And after that, we're going to talk about how difficult it would be to actually take this path toward solving the problem. That is, would we actually have to have a constitutional amendment to, make these ideas become law? Would we have to convince a majority of the population to believe something they just don't believe in currently? Or is it more straightforward than that? Would we just need to, change some laws in ways that most people would probably accept? So let's talk about taxation policy in the US and let's talk about why we would need to change it. What problem we're trying to solve. And so the problem we're trying to solve here is the very serious problem of the federal deficit and the national debt. Okay, so what is that? Federal deficit, national debt. What does that mean? Well, the federal deficit is the amount of money that the government takes in each year relative to how much it spends each year. So when we talk about the federal deficit, the word deficit implies that the United States government is taking in less money than it's spending. So that means at the end of the year, it owes more money than it did at the beginning of the year. And just to use a more relatable example, let's suppose we have a person who earns $55,000 a year in wage income. They work and they earn $55,000 a year, but their spending is $75,000 a year. So the lifestyle they're maintaining, they have to spend $75,000 a year to maintain that lifestyle, but they're only earning $55,000 a year. That means each year they're deficiting $20,000. That is, each year, in order to live that lifestyle, they have to borrow an extra $20,000 to cover the shortfall because their income doesn't come up to the level of their spending. So that person who's in that situation, their annual deficit is $20,000. And the United States government currently has an annual deficit. In fact, this year, the annual deficit of the United States government is going to be about 2 trillion with a T, $2 trillion. That's $2,000 billion. That's a lot of money. And the reason for that is because the government revenue, that's the money the government takes in this year, is going to be about $5.5 trillion. And of course, most government income comes from taxes. So the taxes you pay and other people pay and businesses pay, that makes up the bulk of government income. That's where the government gets most of its money. and this year it's going to be about $5.5 trillion. But the government is slated to spend this year $7.5 trillion. So it's taking in $5.5 trillion, mostly from taxes, but it's spending $7.5 trillion. That means at the end of this year, the government's going to owe $2 trillion more than it owed at the beginning of this year. Now, where does the government get the extra money for that? I mean, to maintain that lifestyle, right, the government's going to have to borrow that extra $2 trillion to maintain that level of spending. Just like if a person earns $55,000 in a year but spends $75,000, they're going to have to borrow to get that extra $20,000. Maybe they'll borrow from credit cards. You know, they'll spend credit card money, which is borrowed money. They have to pay it back with interest. Or maybe the bank will loan them the money. But they're going to have to borrow to make up that deficit spending. And our government does the same. When our government spends more than it makes, it has to borrow the extra money. But of course, when you borrow the money, no one's going to just give our government $2 trillion, you know, out of the goodness of their heart. People are willing to finance our deficit, but only if we pay them back with interest, so that they make some money off of loaning us the $2 trillion. You know, just like if you were to use a credit card or a bank loan to, you know, get some extra money for your expenses, to cover your expenses, you have to pay back those loans with interest. Credit card use is just essentially a bank loaning you money. And if you don't pay back all that money within 20 days or so, then you got to pay interest on it. So when the way that our government borrows money is by selling treasury bonds, United States treasury bonds and treasury notes and treasury bills. Okay, these are just promises from our government that, you know, you give us this money, you loan us this money, and we'll pay you back over a certain amount of time with a certain amount of interest. So you'll get back more money than you gave us. And that's how they get people to finance us. And because the United States government has never defaulted on a loan, that is, we've never not paid back loans that we've taken out or money that we've borrowed, you know, people trust us. And because of that, we don't have to pay a lot of interest. We can pay relatively low interest, like 3 or 4%. And people are going to be willing to loan us trillions of dollars. But we do have to pay some interest on it. So it's not free money. So currently, like I said, this year, the US deficit, which is just the annual amount, the yearly amount of spending relative to income. And when the spending is more than the income, you run a deficit that year. So the annual national deficit or federal deficit is, you know, the amount in any given year that you spend more than you take in. We also have a national debt. So let's go back to the human example, right? $55,000 a year is what I make. $75,000 a year is what I spend. So this year, if I do that, I have to borrow $20,000 in order to cover the shortfall. But let's suppose I've been doing that for 10 years. So that means over the last 10 years, my cumulative debt, all of the debt that I've incurred over the last 10 years is not $20,000, it's $200,000. 20,000 times 10 years. 20,000 a year times 10 years. So I've managed to accumulate 200,000 in debt over the last 10 years. So that 200,000 is my total debt. That's all the money I owe for all the years that I've been spending more than I make. So the difference between the deficit and the debt is the deficit is just what does our finances look like this year, and the debt is the accumulation over all the years that we've been around of the total amount of debt that we've taken on. So you can think of national debt as our total debt and national deficit as this year's debt. Okay, so to put real numbers on the government side, I told you that this year our the government revenue, the government income, mostly from taxes, is about $5.5 trillion, but our spending is going to be about $7.5 trillion. So we're 2 trillion in the hole just for this year. But our national debt, that is the amount that our government's in the hole in total, the amount we've had to borrow in total that we still owe, is 40 trillion, $40 trillion. So we've sold $40 trillion in bonds in order to cover all of that debt that we've accumulated over all of these years. The last time the government actually did not run a debt, or last time the government did not have a deficit, the last time our budget was balanced, where we didn't spend more than we made, was back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president. So it's been about 30 years since since we've actually been in balance as far as government revenue versus government spending. So that 40 trillion mostly represents all the money that we've had to borrow over the last 30 years from folks. And what we have to do with that 40 trillion is we have to pay the interest on it. Just like, you can maintain your personal finances without going into bankruptcy, if you can just sort of pay the minimum on all the money you owe, like your credit cards and your bank loans, every month, as long as you keep paying the minimums, then you can keep things going without going into bankruptcy or without defaulting on the loans. And so what our government does is we don't pay back the principal. The 40 trillion stays 40 trillion, even if we no longer run any deficits. Even from now on, we just balance our budget, we still owe 40 trillion. And we still probably won't ever pay it back for real, at least not anytime soon. But what we do have to do is we have to keep paying the interest every year. So since on average the government borrows at about a 3% rate, when people buy our bonds, we have to pay them 3% interest. So 3% of $40 trillion is 1.2 trillion per year, every year. And that's what we have to pay. This year we're spending 1.2 trillion just paying the interest on the national debt, not paying off the debt, paying the interest on the debt. Okay, so, and if next year we borrow another trillion, we're going to owe 40, next year we'll owe 41 trillion. And the amount we're going to have to pay on the national debt, the amount of interest, is going to be higher because the debt's going to be higher. And so if we keep doing this, if we keep running a deficit annually, if we keep spending more than we borrow, spending more than we earn, and having to borrow the rest at a 3 or 4 or 5% interest rate, then every year the amount that we have to put toward paying just the interest on our debt is going to go up. And every year it's going to be a higher percentage of what the government takes in. So eventually you reach a point where most of the money the government takes in is being used just to finance its debt, with no money left over for anything else, for Social Security, for Medicare, for Medicaid, for paying the military, for government services, for government agencies, for a government police force. The money just doesn't exist because it's all going to paying off the debt. Right now, that 1.2 trillion represents 20% of the total amount of money that the government takes in. Remember, I said the government takes in $5.5 trillion a year in taxes. And so 1.2 trillion, that's 20% of 5.5 trillion. So that means that just the money this year that we're paying in interest on the national debt is 20% of the total federal revenue. 20% of the money that the federal government is making. And And if we keep running a higher and higher debt, if we keep accumulating more debt because we're running deficits every year, then that percentage is going to go up and up and up until eventually it just breaks the entire economy. So the bottom line, why am I proposing these changes to our tax system? The bottom line is because we have to get our budget back in balance. If we don't, it's going to be disastrous, particularly for the generations coming up who are going to be saddled with, more and more debt, higher and higher annual payments on the debt, and less government money available to do anything productive. So what that means practically is, in the future, it's going to get worse, more and more deeper and deeper cuts to government services, for example, and to deeper and deeper cuts to government insurance programs. And because there's just more money that we have to set aside to pay off the debt. So that's a terrible situation for any government to be in, and it's not sustainable. Okay, so how did we get here? How did we get to the point? Because I told you back in the 1990s, our government was more or less in balance, expenditures versus revenue. So how did we get so out of balance? And, there's several different reasons. One of the main reasons is demographics. What do I mean by that? I mean that our country has gotten older. We have a higher percentage of people who are retirement age now than we did 30 years ago, and a lower percentage of people who are working age. Now, when people retire, that's when they usually start taking, for example, Social Security, when they have to use more medical services, a lot of which are paid for by the government-run insurance program called Medicare. So when people get older, and particularly when they get to retirement age, they stop paying a lot of taxes because they're no longer earning a wage. So generally, the taxes they pay go way down, but the government revenue that they need goes way up. The amount the government has to spend on them, paying them Social Security, paying them Medicare bills, goes up. So as far as the government's concerned, people get much more expensive after they retire. And what finances those expenses of older folks are the younger working folks. It's the money we take out of their paychecks that finance the expenses of the older folks, for the most part. Not 100%, but for the most part. And so when you have a population that demographically is getting older and older and older, with higher and higher percentage of people in that retirement age range taking more than they're giving into the system, and a lower and lower percentage of people in the working age range who are giving into the system more than they're taking from it, that unbalances the system and leads you to the situation like we are now, where there's you start running higher and higher deficits because the government has to pay out more and more, and there's fewer people paying it. So there's a demographic problem which has really hit the United States hard over the last 30 years. And by the way, we're not the only country with this problem. Around the entire world, there's an aging population. Japan's been hit particularly hard with this, where we've had dropping birth rates in a lot of developed countries, and a larger and larger percentage of people who are in those older age ranges. So it's not just our country dealing with this deficit problem caused by older folks. It's a lot of countries on Earth going through it right now. So that's one reason. Another reason is we're living longer statistically, or at least we were up until COVID hit. Since COVID hit, by the way, the life expectancy of people in the United States has actually dropped a bit. But until before COVID hit, going back 30 years, the life expectancy went up significantly. So we have more people in that retirement age range, and even more than you'd expect because those people are living longer. which means that they need to take from the system for a longer period of time. So those kinds of demographics, life expectancy increases, and more retirees versus fewer workers, really unbalanced the system and led to these structural deficits. So that's one thing. And another thing is, over the last 30 years, we fought some very significant wars, which were really expensive, like the Iraq War and the Afghan War. Wars are very expensive. And we fought a bunch of them. And then during COVID, when the government essentially shut down, and when people essentially stopped going to work and a lot of businesses shut down, we had this period of, it was brief, but we had this period of very high unemployment. And so the government had to just give people money just to, keep, and businesses too, just to keep everyone from going bankrupt, to keep us from going into a deep recession or depression. So that was a huge government expenditure. And then the bailouts that we've had to do for the misdeeds of basically banks and other financial institutions, like back in 2007, 2008 with the housing crisis and stuff, we basically gave $1 trillion to the banking and insurance systems, just to bail everybody out from some really disastrous decision making. So we've had all these crises. We've had war crises, and we've had financial crises, and all of those have been met with bailouts and free government money. And tied up with that problem is the political issue, where politicians find it much easier to give people tax cuts and more government services. Like Trump's big, beautiful tax bill, which he passed last year in his first year of his second presidential term, was basically a big tax cut gift to lots of folks. And what that did is it substantially cut government revenues. Now, if you're going to substantially cut government revenues, you've got to cut government expenditures too, or you get a bigger deficit. But we didn't. We cut government revenue with that bill. We didn't significantly cut government expenditures. In fact, in some ways, we increased government expenditures, and so it ballooned the deficit, and the debt. We now run bigger deficits than we did before. Now, why does that keep happening? It keeps happening because politically, the folks who pass these tax laws, which is Congress, they want to get reelected. And the way that Congress people get reelected is by giving people tax cuts and free government services and money. And that just increases the debt and the deficit. But to do the opposite of that, to bring the government expenditures back in balance, we would either have to increase government revenue, or we would have to cut government expenditures, or both, some combination of both. And increasing government revenue means we tax people and businesses more. And decreasing government expenditures means we give folks less, free government stuff, less federal insurance money, less benefits, less perks, less tax breaks. And that's what you would need to do. And less government services too. That's what you would need to do in order to bring these things back into balance, to get us to, a position where the government is no longer running a deficit annually. We'd have to raise taxes and cut government expenses, which means give folks less government stuff, government paid stuff. And to do that is political suicide. If I'm elected to represent some folks and I vote to increase their taxes and reduce their government services and benefits, then they're going to kick me out of office pretty darn quick. So not only did we have all these episodes where we needed to spend more federally, but all the incentives in Congress are for Congress people to vote for fiscal irresponsibility, to not try to balance the budget, because balancing the budget is political suicide. So all of those things combine to get us to where we are, but we are where we are, And so what I thought about when I thought about this problem is, how do we solve this problem in a way that makes the tax structure of the United States more fair and minimizes the pain, especially the initial pain, that people, and especially people on the lower end of the income scale, are going to feel as we do this politically unpopular thing. Because right now, one of the problems with our tax code is not just that the government's not taking in enough revenue to pay for its expenses, but also that the tax code is skewed in a way that's very unfair. We tend to tax very rich individuals and rich companies. So big corporations and rich individuals, they tend to pay a lower tax rate than middle class folks do, a much lower tax rate. And that's fundamentally, not only does that hurt us as far as the deficit goes, but it's fundamentally unfair. As Warren Buffett, a famous investor, once said, I pay, he's a billionaire. He said, I pay a lower tax rate to the federal government than my secretary does. And, that's just not fair. The rich who've received a lot of government benefit, if you get rich in our country was very good to you. And you got a lot of benefit living here. So, they should be paying their fair share. I don't want them to pay everything, but I do want them to pay their fair share, and they're not doing that now. So part of this proposal that I have here addresses that unfairness in the tax code, but it also increases tax rates so that the government gets more revenue and we can bring the budget back into balance. And this includes some additional taxes for people who aren't on the very top of the scale. So under this, middle class folks would also pay some more in tax. But the vast majority of these tax increases that I'm proposing would fall on the rich companies and rich individuals. So the harm to folks on the lower end of the scale would be much reduced. And in a lot of cases, if you brought the government deficit down, and say you were able to get down to about a balanced budget, or maybe have the government run a little surplus, have the government actually be able to take in more revenue than it's spending, then you could use some of that extra money to improve government services. And that would benefit people on the lower end of the income scale more than it would benefit people on the upper end of the scale. So, you could sort of sell this to people on the lower end of the scale by saying, okay, there's certain taxes here that will cause you to pay more to the government, but here's what you're going to get for it. Like, what you're going to get for it is the peace of mind of never having to worry about medical care again, or the expenses of medical care, because it's going to be covered by the government. Or never having to worry about educational expenses again, because it's going to be covered by the government. And so you can, those kinds of expenses are the kind that fall disproportionately on the middle class. And so if we can use a balanced budget or even a federal surplus to help pay for those, the services for those folks, and expand their services, then they're really getting something for their money. But as I said, the way I've structured it here is most of the tax increases are going to fall on richer folks and richer companies. Okay, so let's get into it, some specifics here. And what I want to do is I want to start out by comparing the US to European governments. Taxation here in the US versus taxation in Europe. And the reason I want to compare us to Europe is Europe tends to have very generous government insurance, social insurance programs. For example, most of Europe has some version of national health insurance, where when you have to get medical care, if you're, a citizen of the country, you don't pay anything for it. There's no copays, there's no deductibles, there's no bill. And the reason is because you essentially prepay for your medical care in the sense of they pay higher taxes. And that extra tax money is used by the government to pay everybody's medical bills. And it's also used by the government to pay other bills too. So for example, in Europe, most European countries, they have very, very generous family leave where, when I become a new parent, I may get 6 months off paid to spend the first 6 months of my child's life with them at home and not have to go to work. And my unemployment benefits may be very generous. Like in England, when you're unemployed and you can't find work, the government essentially, pays your bills while you're looking for work. And that can go on for years. And in some European countries, for example, college is free, it's tuition free. And again, all of that is paid for by the higher tax rates that people pay over there. So that's the reason I want to compare the US to Europe, because the US does not have such generous, social insurance programs as they do in Europe. But we have lower tax rate. So let's sort of compare it. In Europe, how does the federal government's funded in Europe, like the government of Germany or of France or of England? Where does it get its money from? Well, again, mostly taxes, but which taxes? So in Europe, they have something called a VAT tax, a value-added tax. That's essentially a federal sales tax. In the United States, we don't have that. We don't have a federal sales tax. In the United States, we do have sales taxes. That's taxes charged by the government on goods and services. But in the United States, those are state taxes and local taxes. So the sales taxes are given to the state and the municipalities, not to the government. Government doesn't make any money on that. But in Europe, they have a value-added tax, which is a national sales tax. And that, in most European nations, that runs about 20%. There's no place in the United States that has a 20% sales tax. Even the most tax-heavy states in the United States, the sales tax runs about 10, 11, 12% at the highest. And then there are states in the US that don't have sales tax at all. So, that's a significant increase in taxation. That's a tax on, purchase of goods and services. It's not an income tax. It's what you pay when you buy stuff. Now, the federal government in Europe most of the federal governments in Europe, they take some of that 20% sales tax and they give some of that money back to the states and maybe even to certain municipalities. So some of that tax money is distributed down back to the states. But still, it's a much higher tax than any kind of sales tax we have here. In Europe, they have a social service tax or health tax. That's the tax that pays for all these generous government insurance programs, like, their free medical care, essentially, which isn't actually free. I mean, no such thing as free medical care. Somebody's got to pay for it, right? Doctors have to be paid. Hospitals have to be paid. But in Europe, it's the government that pays the doctors. It's the government that pays the hospitals. And the money that they use to pay the hospitals and the doctors is this money that they collect from the social services taxes or the health taxes. And in most of the European countries, those taxes run about 20% of earned income. And so if you're employed by a business, you pay 20% of your income to the national health tax, and then the business that employs you also pays 20% of the income they pay you. So that's what's called a payroll tax, which means it's a tax that's split between the employer and the employee based on how much the employee is earning. And so that's about a 20% tax in most European countries, although there's some European countries that have that as a 40% tax or 30% tax. So it's significant. It's a very significant tax. Then there's just a general income tax, which pays for other government, operations like the military and, the normal things the government does, pays for government employees. So the income tax on earned income, and that tops out at about 50% in Europe. So most European countries, that tax is anywhere from 0% to 50%, depending on how much a person earns. In the United States, just for comparison, the United States does not have we do have a social service tax, which I'll talk about, but our income tax in the US tops out at 37% for high earners. In Europe, it tops out around 50% for high earners. So for people who make a lot of money, it goes higher in Europe than here. Also, Europeans have a business tax, which is a tax on business profits. That's the same as we have here. But their business tax tops out at 50% of business profits, and our business tax in the US tops out at 21%. So very significant difference in tax rate between Europe and us. They have a much higher tax on business profits, and we have a lower tax. They have a higher tax at the high end on personal income tax. We have a lower tax. They have 20 to 40% social service tax. Now, we also have a social service payroll tax. That's the Medicare tax and the FICA, which is Social Security tax. So we do have that. We just call it Social Security, which is a payroll tax that pays for the Social Security payouts for older folks. And then the Medicare tax, which pays for the medical insurance, federal medical insurance for older folks. But our tax is 6.5% for individuals for Social Security and 2.5% 1.5% for Medicare. So the total for individuals, the total payroll tax, which are equivalent of health tax or social service tax, for individuals in the U.S. is 8%, 6.5% plus 1.5%. It's 8%. Whereas in Europe, again, 20 to 40%. So, and then a kind of tax that's way higher in Europe than it is in the United States is the estate tax. That's the amount of money that's taken from estates that are passed on from somebody who dies to their beneficiaries. So what they used to call the death taxes. So in Europe, there's an exclusion, an amount below which an estate wouldn't have to pay any tax. And again, the exclusion varies from country to country in Europe, but typically it's anywhere from $250,000 to $1 million is the excluded amount. So in most European countries, I think it's around 500,000. So if you have, for example, a $1.5 million estate that you pass on, the state's going to have to pay some taxes when the estate transfers. There's going to be some estate taxes that are owed to the government. Whereas in our country, the exclusion amount is $15 million to $30 million. So that means that an estate that's passed on in the U.S., would have to be valued at more than $15 million in order to pay any federal tax at all. And very few estates in the United States are worth $15 million. Fewer than 1% of people pass on a $15 million estate. In fact, I think it's less than 0.5% pass on estates that big. So that means that the vast majority, 99 point whatever percent of estates in the United States don't have to pay any federal tax at all because the deduction is so high. Whereas most estates in Europe actually do have to pay some tax, some estate tax. And in the United States, it gets even better than that because for the beneficiaries, for the people who actually get something from the estate, they can use what's called a stepped up basis value. When they receive something from the estate that has equity, and then they choose to sell, if they choose to sell it, they get what's called a stepped up basis on the equity, which is a real generous perk. So what does that mean, stepped up basis? Well, let's suppose my parents buy a house for $1 million and they live in it for a while and now it's worth $3 million. But, they get older, they can't live in this big house anymore, and so they decide to sell the house while they're still alive. So they sell their house for $3 million. Well, they have to pay taxes on the equity in the home, the difference between what they sold the house for and what they bought it for. So if they bought it for $1 million and they sold it for $3 million, they have to pay federal tax, what's called the capital gains tax, on the $2 million that they made in profit from the house. And the same would be true with stocks. If my parents bought a whole bunch of stocks over the years that they paid let's say they paid $250,000 for all their stocks, but then the stocks went up in value, and as they got older, they decided to sell the stocks. So they sell the stocks for $1 million. So stocks they bought for $250,000, they sold for $1 million. Well, the profit that they made on those stocks is $750,000. The difference between $250,000 and $1 million. So they're going to have to pay federal tax, capital gains tax, on this $750,000. And these are substantial taxes. So what's interesting in the United States is that stepped up basis rule. So let's suppose my parents bought a house for $1 million, but never sold it. They just kept it until they died. And when they died, they left it to me. But by the time they died and left it to me, it was worth $3 million. Okay, so now I get the house essentially for free, right? But now I want to sell the house because I don't really want to live there. So I sell the house. How much tax do I have to pay? Well, if I sell the house for $3 million, the answer is no tax at all. Because my equity basis for the house is not what my parents paid for the house that they left to me. It's what the house was worth on the day my last parent died and left the house to me, on the day I took ownership of the house, which is technically the day they died. That's what they now calculate the equity, what equity is now calculated on, is the value of the home when I received it, not when they bought it. And so if I receive the home because my parents died and it's worth $3 million, and I sell it 6 months later and I sell it for $3 million, since the equity basis of the home for me is $3 million, I don't owe any tax at all. I essentially, technically, had no equity in the house because of the stepped-up basis. Same thing with stocks, right? If my parents left me stocks, the cost basis of the stocks is whatever they were worth on the day that my parents died, or on the day that my last parent died. And So if I sell the stocks soon after that, they're probably not worth much more than they were on the day my parents died, and so I don't owe any taxes. So that's what's called stepped up equity. The equity jumps, the cost basis for calculating equity values jumps from whatever it was that my parents really paid for something to whatever it was worth when they died. For me, if I'm the beneficiary. So that's a sweet deal for beneficiaries. In a lot of European countries, they don't do that. So that means if I inherit a house in Europe that's worth 3 million, but my parents only paid $1 million for it, I still have to, and then I sell the house, I still have to pay the tax on the $2 million difference. So here in this country, we have this very sweet deal when we inherit property or we inherit stocks because of that stepped up basis. In Europe, they don't tend to have that. And by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of equity versus investment equity versus say income. I'll give you a quick little lesson on that. We have in this country a different tax rate for regular wage income versus what are called capital gains. Capital gains is the money that you earn on an investment, like a stock or a house. It's when you buy these things, if they go up in value, that's considered an earning. And when you sell those things, then you have to pay what's called the capital gains tax if you sell it for more than you bought it for. But you don't have to pay any tax until you actually sell it. So if I have a house if I buy a house, it goes up in value. If I buy stocks, that go up in value. Even if they keep going up in value every year, I don't have to pay tax on them until I sell them. But then when I sell them, I have to pay tax on the difference between what I bought that for and what I'm selling it for. So if I sell it for more than I bought it for, I have to pay what's called a capital gains tax. But that money that I made from the investment is taxed at the capital gains rates, which in this country only go up to about 20%. Whereas the money I earn in wages, working for a living, I have to pay tax on that every year, and every time I get paid, basically, so every week, every month. And that rate goes up, the tax rate on wages goes up to 37%. Tax rate on capital gains goes up to 20%. In most European countries, they don't distinguish. They don't have a separate tax rate for capital gains income versus wage income. They treat them the same. In our country, we have a difference, and capital gains is favored. That gets the lower tax rate. Now, I've always felt that was really unfair and actually kind of insulting to people who work for a living, because I don't have to do a darn thing to make capital gains money, right? I just buy something like a house or stock and I just let it sit there. And, if it goes up in value, I'm earning money and I don't have to do anything. Like I buy stock, I put it in an investment account, I forget about it for 5 years. And it makes me money because, it keeps growing in value if that's what happens. And so at some point, and what's great about it too is as it grows in value, I don't have to pay taxes on it. So my stocks this year may be worth twice what they were 2 years ago, but I don't have to pay any tax on that, even though I'm technically wealthier now. And I didn't do anything for it. I just bought these stocks and put them in an investment account, and then forgot about them. So to get taxed less on investments, which you don't have to do anything for, versus wages, which you have to actually do work, that to me is just insulting to people who work. And so part of my proposal, which you'll see when we get there, is I go to the European system where there isn't a real difference between capital gains rate, tax rates, and regular wage rates. But in any case, these are the ways that European governments get more revenue, which they then use to fund more social insurance programs like, universal health care, health insurance, and generous paid leave and free college and all that. They can do that because they take in a lot more money in tax revenue. They have the national sales tax, the VAT tax, which we don't have. They have income and business taxes, which go up to higher rates than ours do. They don't distinguish between capital gains and regular wage income tax. So they don't tax investment at a lower rate than regular wages. And by the way, the folks who earn more from capital gains tend to be richer folks. They were folks that had the money to invest, to buy nice homes, to purchase lots of stock. If you have money to do that, usually you're a wealthier person. So when you have the capital gains rate very low, lower than wage rate, that basically favors richer folks. They end up paying less on the income that they get than people who are working for a living have to pay on the income they get. Of course, the European estate tax is much higher than the American estate tax. It has a much lower exemption, and it doesn't have that stepped up basis issue in most European countries. So, and the rates are pretty high. Estate tax rates in Europe are 40 to 50%. And actually in the United States, the estate tax rate is 40% too, but it only applies to estates that are more than $15 million, which is very, very few estates. And you still get the stepped up basis. So sweet deal. Our government gets way less money from estate taxes than European governments do. In fact, the European governments get a substantial portion of their tax revenue from estate taxes. And in the United States, our government gets virtually nothing from estate taxes. So they have higher business tax, they have higher income tax, they have a VAT tax, which we don't have, a national sales tax, they have much higher estate taxes. And they have the social services tax, which we have too, but theirs is a lot higher. Ours is 8% of wages, theirs is 20 to 40% of wages. So the reason that the European governments can give all these generous benefits is because they tax their folks way higher. Now I've also put here, the way state and local governments are financed. Basically, state and local governments in Europe, they get a portion of that VAT tax. That's a portion of that national sales tax is remitted back to the states. And just a portion of just the general federal income is given to the states as block grants usually. And then just like we do here, the state and local governments have local service fees and fines like parking tickets and that kind of stuff. And then the primary funding for state governments there, like it is here, is property taxes. Just like here in the United States, property taxes fund state and local governments. They don't fund the national government. There's no federal property tax in Europe, and there's no federal property tax here in the United States either. And interestingly, the property tax rates in Europe and the United States are pretty much the same, like in the 1% to 2% range usually, where every year you have to pay 1% to 2% of the assessed value of your home and property taxes. Or if you own a business property, the assessed value of the business property. But here in the United States, one thing that's different, here in the United States, we only reassess the value of a property for property tax purposes when the property is sold. So for example, if I've been living in my house for 20 years, the last time my house value was assessed was 20 years ago. So even though it's now 20 years later and my house is worth 3 times what it used to be, I'm only paying property tax on the value of the property when I bought it, not on the current value. In Europe, there's regular reassessments usually of property values, and they're not just reassessed on sale. And so the valuations for property tax purposes tend to be much more current, which means higher, which means that the state and local governments get more money from properties over there, even though the rate's the same. Like, here we may have a 1.5% property tax. There they may have a 1.5% property tax, but they get more revenue from their 1.5% because their properties have been reassessed more recently. And so the value that 1.5% is based on is more current value. Okay, so I did all that comparison, and here's the US version of it. I did all that comparison just so you can see what it takes the European governments, what they have to charge in taxes in order to have enough money to cover all the services that they offer. They tend to offer a lot more social insurance and services than we do, but the reason they can do that is because their tax rates are significantly higher. So that means that government revenue is significantly higher than ours is. Okay, so I've just put comparisons down here: the Social Security tax, the Medicare payroll tax. Those are taxes that are split between the employer and the employee. And then our income tax, our business profits tax, which tops out at 21%. Our capital gains tax, which is normally 20%. We have also those licensing and excise taxes, etc. Those are a very small percentage of our federal income. And we have the estate taxes, but we have $15 million exemption, and we have a stepped up cost basis for investments in property. And then our state governments and local governments are funded by parcel taxes, which is a kind of property tax, and regular property taxes, and local and state sales taxes. We don't have a national sales tax. There's no VAT in the US. So states and local governments, they set their own property tax rates. And they use that money to fund state things like education, for example. There's also some block grants, which are given to states by the federal government for certain purposes. For example, federal grants are given to states to partially fund Medicaid programs, which is health insurance for very poor folks. Okay, so there's your comparison. But the problem, again, is that, yes, we have lower taxes than Europe, but because our taxes are pretty low, we run these annual deficits, particularly at the national level. Most of the states in the United States actually are not allowed to run an ongoing deficit, which means that if the state doesn't get enough money to cover all of its services each year, it has to cut some of its services or increase its state taxes. States, of course, also have state income taxes too. Did I not put that down? Oh, well, I got to put that down. Sorry about that. So states also have state income tax. That's usually the biggest actual funder of, of the states is state income tax. But again, we have some states with no income tax. And we have some states with no sales taxes. I don't think we have any states with no property tax, though. I think property tax is actually in every state. Interestingly, a state with one of the highest property tax rates is Texas, which doesn't have like I don't think it has much of a state income tax and not much in the way of sales taxes either. But Texas actually has a higher than normal property tax rate. But one of the reasons that Texas can be so generous is Texas has a lot of oil and natural gas, and the oil and natural gas that's drilled up and in Texas, produces a lot of revenue for Texas. Texas keeps a lot of the money from the oil and natural gas that they extract from their own land and sell. And so because they have so much oil and natural gas underground there, they're able to cover a lot of state expenditures with that, just with the revenue that they get from selling that stuff. Okay, even with all of this, though, our federal government in particular is running a $2 trillion deficit every year. And again, that's not sustainable. If that keeps up, we're going to reach a point where the only thing the federal government has money to do is cover the interest payments on all the money that it's borrowed. It won't have money to do anything else. Won't even have money to stand up a military. So, we really have to do something about the federal deficit, and clearly these tax rates here aren't covering it. Now, some people just say, well, we could just, cut the expenditures by $2 trillion. But to cut government expenditures by $2 trillion would be very, very difficult. First of all, we spend $1.2 trillion every year just paying the interest on the debt that we owe. And we can't default on that interest. The government of the United States can't just decide, well, we're not going to pay interest this year. If we did that, we'd be in default on the loans. All those people who bought treasuries from us, we'd be defaulting on those treasuries. And that would make the US dollar essentially worthless globally. And would cause just massive inflation worldwide. Because the US dollar, which is the currency that's used for a lot of international transactions, most international transactions are done in dollars. And if the dollar is suddenly worthless because we're not paying our debts, then the whole global economy goes to hell, and very, very quickly. So, we have to pay the 1.2 trillion every year because we owe that money. And there are things we could cut. Some government employees, some government agencies, some could even cut military expenditures. All of those things would reduce the number of government workers and employees. And they might make us a weaker nation or a less able nation. We could cut some of those things. But things that we couldn't cut or that would be very difficult to cut, we have Medicare, which pays for a lot of the medical care of older folks. We have Medicaid, which pays for medical care for poor folks. We have Social Security, which gives people a wage in their retirement. And if you add up the money the government spends on just currently right now, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the service on our debt, the 1.2 trillion we have to pay in interest on our debt, already you've gotten about 90% of government expenditures. So everything else the government pays for outside of those things only amounts to like 10 to 20% of total government expenditures. So if you're talking about significantly cutting government expenditures, the only expenditure that, can really be cut without ruining the lives of a whole lot of people would be military expenditures. But beyond that, if you want to really cut significantly, and you'd have to cut $2 trillion, you'd be cutting into Medicaid, you'd be cutting into Medicare, you'd be cutting into Social Security. And, those are benefits that people have come to really rely on. So, difficult choices. So I think in a lot of ways it would be easier for the government to raise more revenue than for the government to cut a lot of expenditures, which isn't to say that we couldn't cut anything. There's certainly some expenditures we could cut without, ruining too many lives. But, just as a general matter, to reduce that $2 trillion shortfall that we have every year, you'd really need to increase taxes. Okay, so how do we do it? What's the best way to increase taxes? I've sort of been hinting at these ways as we've been talking so far. And so I'm going to get in now to my actual proposal for, how do we redo taxes to make them fairer and to, get the government revenues more in balance with the expenditures. So since I've been taking up a lot of time just sort of giving background on this so far and doing some comparison, I think I'll save this part, the actual proposal part, for the next video. So we'll call this the end of video 1 on taxation, changing the tax code, and then the next part will be video 2, which will be the actual proposal and the reasons behind. I'm going to give you reasons behind all of the different aspects of this proposal. Okay? So see you in the next video.